Welcome back to the London Jesuit Centre for our third episode on creation. I'm John Moffatt, and in this episode, we're going to try to guess intelligently what the author or authors of Genesis 1 were trying to say with their account of the origin of the world. And we're going to use the background material from last time to guide us. We're going to be paying special attention to the question what sort of genre the authors think they are writing in. Do they think they are writing scientific history? Or do they think they are writing something more like a mythic parable, conveying important personal and religious truths, but not necessarily claiming to describe what actually happened? Notice that I have said author or authors throughout. We need to clear this up first. It can seem a bit disturbing because people of Jesus' time and most of the later theologians of the church believed that one person, Moses, wrote the whole of the Pentateuch. We all like to think of a single great author like Shakespeare and Dickens, producing their masterpieces single-handedly. Sometimes that is largely true. However, even the novel that you are reading now will have been heavily altered from the author's original manuscript in the process of copy editing. In fact, when we ask who wrote Hamlet, we also have to ask which version. Then we get into questions about who adapted the shorter version for the road and who makes decisions about which bits to perform. When we ask who wrote Casablanca, we find 3 different writers collaborated, one for comedy, one for drama, and one for romance. The final decision about whether Rick or Laszlo goes on the plane was taken more or less right at the end of shooting. So we don't need to be worried if there are different hands at work in what we usually think of as a single text. It doesn't stop a film or a play or a book from being a great piece of art. When we put Genesis 1 and Genesis 2 side by side, we find their styles and contents are very different. Even though the final copy editor found a way of putting them together that makes a sort of sense. But this should not worry us. We can still usefully ask what the authors thought they were doing individually and collectively as the material passed through those different hands on the way to the final cut. Let's look first at the world described in Genesis 1. It is very tidily organized. The plants and different sorts of animal are carefully classified in their kinds. A hard dome, like a giant glass colander, holds the waters of chaos apart from the waters of the oceans. This explains how water can come from the sky and how land can emerge out of water. The sun, moon, and stars are put there to mark times, seasons, and festivals. This has echoes of the ancient Babylonian version of the creation of the world by the god Marduk. There may be even stronger echoes of a similar ancient Egyptian creation story. But there are some very significant and interesting differences. But let's begin with the similarities. The Babylonian myth, based on an older Sumerian original, has the separation of waters and the creation of a firmament. The Egyptian myth has the earth emerge out of the waters like land reappearing after the Nile floods. In the Babylonian myth, the sun, moon, and stars are there to mark the seasons of the year, as in Genesis. But here is the big difference. In the Babylonian myth, the act of creation is set in the context of a brutal dynastic struggle among the gods. Marduk fashions his world out of the dismembered body of the goddess he has defeated in battle. In the Egyptian myth, the god Amun generates himself to bring light into the darkness of the primal chaos. According to one account, he appears as a bird. Our authors lived in those cultures and seem aware of their myths, but they treat them in a new way. They seem to respect them as ancient sources conveying useful, timeless wisdom. But to find the underlying wisdom, they have to leave some of the more colourful, mythic bits aside. The result looks much more scientific, with the one true God creating an orderly physical universe. And there is the big theological point. Everything in the world apart from God is a creature, created by God's word. Contrast the Babylonians, who think of the stars and planets as gods. Contrast the Egyptians. For them, the waters of chaos are 4 pairs of male and female deities. In most contemporary ancient myths, Babylonian, Egyptian, or Greek, the generations of the heavens and the earth means the various dynasties of celestial beings. But for the authors of Genesis, these celestial bodies are creatures, alongside all the other creatures made by God, one after the other. It is God's activity that makes each day of the week sacred, not, as in Babylon, whichever of the 7 planets governs that day. But we can notice something else: the importance of light, dark, and goodness. This looks like a hint at the supreme god of the Persians, Ahura Mazda, the god of light and goodness, who eternally wrestles with darkness and evil and overcomes it. Here is a giant theological step. The Jewish intelligentsia have discovered that they can think more deeply about their own God by reflecting on what the ancient nations around them say about theirs. We actually have a copy of one of Cyrus's decrees, sending people back to their own lands to pray to their gods for his empire. It is written in Babylonian and addressed to the people of Babylon. Cleverly, Cyrus identifies the supreme god of the Persians, who has helped him rescue the peoples of his empire, with the Babylonians' favourite god, Marduk. When we set this beside the writings of 2nd Isaiah, we find the mirror image of this. The God who has anointed Cyrus to rescue his people is the Lord, the God of the Hebrew peoples. The theological idea at the heart of 2nd Isaiah and Genesis 1 bears a strong and unsurprising resemblance to the words of Cyrus, the Persian conqueror. We can notice a third thing. There are themes in this account of creation that are priestly. They pre-echo the ritual laws of Exodus and Leviticus. The clear separation of creatures in their kinds is an important element in the purity laws. And the stars are there to mark religious festivals. The 6 days of creation lead up to the weekly celebration of the Sabbath, when God's faithful people, along with the whole cosmos, share in God's rest. Crucially, these authors put all human beings in a special relationship with God. God explicitly commands them to increase and rule the earth. Humans themselves are made in the image of God. This noble status underlines another theological point. It is clearly pointless for humans to worship statues in human or animal form, the mere image of an image. The idea of a covenant, a special relationship between God and his people, is important throughout the Old Testament. In Genesis 1, that idea is projected back in history, not just for the Jewish people, but for all human beings. But there is also a reminder that at the heart of any covenant is worshipping the one true God and not bowing down to false gods and idols. So the authors of Genesis 1 seem to be thinking as philosopher-scientists, as theologians committed to the Lord, and as priests committed to the rituals and the rules of the covenant. They are reacting to the ancient traditions that they are encountering in exile, and reworking them to make their sense of them. Do they believe they are giving a precise account of the origin of the world? The people who read their words very shortly after certainly thought they were. But what is more likely is that this was their best guess for the sort of thing that might have happened at the beginning, based on the ancient traditions they had discovered and their own commitment to worshipping the Lord alone. There are parallels in the writings of the Greek philosopher Plato. In his philosophical dialogues, he will often include a reworked ancient myth that is more than just a random story. This sort of myth contains important theological and human truths about who we are and our place in the world. For the authors of Genesis, their best guess about the origin of all things does justice to ancient traditions and to their own religious concerns. It also forms an explanatory prequel to everything else that will follow: the legends and the history of the Lord's people. In this episode, we've tried to get into the heads of the authors of Genesis chapter 1 and understand what they might have been trying to say. We've seen that they are mainly writing as theologians, committed to the Jewish covenant with the Lord and its rituals. But through their encounter with the traditions and theologies of the surrounding culture, they now have an awareness that this covenant is for all humanity. They have put all this together in their retelling of the creation of the world as a 6th century BC best guess about how things might have been in the beginning. In the next episode, we'll explore the next 2 chapters of Genesis, which have a very different flavour. We will ask what those authors might have been interested in, and think a bit more about what it means to use ancient myths to truthfully express contemporary insights. Thank you for listening, and see you next time.